In this tutorial, we'll walk you through two topics: how to create encounter tables, and then how to associate those encounter tables with a dungeon level. The process begins up here on the admin control panel on the encounter subtab. You'll note that there are three subtabs on this panel. These tabs are organized in a logical sequence that simplifies building your encounter tables. This first tab, Random Encounter Table, is for defining the encounter table. Although it is somewhat busy, it actually is a fairly elegant widget for creating your tables. How this works is in three steps. The first thing you do is you enter your encounter table name in this field over here that presently says new ET name. ET stands for encounter table. I'll call this Barrow Level 1. And then you click on this new encounter table button here, and what that will do is populate your encounter table to this list of encounter tables over here. This list will be a repository of all the encounter tables you create. Now presently, as this is a test version of Dungeon Builder, there are only 3 encounter tables here: a default encounter table of 4th level and the one I just created. Once you've created your encounter table, the next step is to populate it with monsters. As you'll see on the left-hand side of this pane here, we have a listing of monsters. It's not very large, there's only about 8 or 9 in here, but this is the listing of all the monsters that are in the monster database. I'll be picking from this listing in order to create the monsters in my encounter table, Barrow Level 1, which you can see right now over here on the right-hand pane is presently empty because I just created the encounter table. Let me add a few monsters here in order to show you how this works. And you add monsters by clicking on the add button here with the arrows. And what that does is it pulls monsters from the left-hand side over to the right-hand side. The reason why it works this way as opposed to leaving them on the left-hand side is that you don't want to get confused as to what monsters are in your encounter table and what monsters are not. So by keeping them only in one place at a time, you don't get confused. Now 5 monsters is not a lot, but it'll give me enough in order to illustrate what I need to show you. Now, so I don't lose the work I've done so far, I'm going to click Save, and this is very important to do. If you leave the screen without clicking Save, you will lose all of your changes. So remember to save your encounter tables as you build them. Now, the third step is to configure the frequency and number appearing for the monsters in your table. You'll notice that when we added each monster to the table, some very important data was automatically generated. This data shows the monster's name, the default probability of that monster occurring, which you may have noticed changes as the monsters are added to the table. There's also something called weighting and a default number appearing, which is always 1 die 6. Now these values are defaults for our encounter table, but we don't have to live with these. We can change them. By double-clicking on a monster's name, I'll pick on the orcs here, a little edit window pops up that allows us to change the weighting and the number appearing for each monster in the table. What weights are is a means to shape the ultimate probability of a monster appearing by giving it a weight relative to all other monsters. The higher the weight, the more likely that this particular monster will occur when compared to other monsters in the table. While you can probably figure out in your head what the probabilities of a given monster occurring are when you're only dealing with 5 to 10 monsters, once you get to 15 or 20 monsters in your table, or perhaps more, each with a different relative frequency, things can get really complicated. So what we have here is this weighting concept that allows you to assign a weight to a monster relative to the other monsters. And then we let Dungeon Builder do all the math to figure out what the final probability should be for each monster. So I'm going to increase the weight of these orcs from 50, which is the default, to 100, which is double the default weight. I can also change the number appearing by simply clicking on this 1 die 6 field here, and a hidden screen appears that allows you to use the die cut metaphor to completely redefine the number appearing. So I'm going to change this to, say, 3 die 4 plus 2. Okay, so each time you come across orcs in this level of the dungeon, you're going to get a minimum of 6, and I'll save that. And you'll see how it updates the orc entry here. But notice how this update took place. Notice that the orc probability is now 33%, and all the other monsters are 16%. Now this is a rounding issue, but basically the orcs have double the probability of occurring as any of the other monsters in this table, as all the other monsters have the default probability. Now this weighting relationship, which causes the orcs to have double the probability of the other monsters, holds whether we add monsters or subtract them. Like suppose I decide to add the ant soldier, so we'll now have 6 monsters in the table. All the other monsters drop down to 14%, including the soldier ant, which is down here at the bottom. But the orc remains at double the probability of all the other monsters. And if I were to delete this ant soldier and delete the apes and drop it down to 4 monsters in the table, 3 of the monsters have a 20% probability of occurring, and the orc has 40%, or double the other monsters. So the relationship holds regardless of how many monsters are in the table once you set the weighting. Now, if I wanted to add additional monsters or customize them like I did with the orcs, I could do so. But for now, I'm going to say this is good enough and just save my changes. And that is how you define an encounter table. You can create as many encounter tables as you want. There is no limit. Now, if you don't like the name of your encounter table or you want to delete it, well, all you have to do is select on the rename button up here to change the name, or on the delete button in order to delete the encounter table, which will ask you to confirm that you want to do that, which I don't. Now that your encounter table is defined, the fourth and final step is to associate your encounter table with one of the levels of your dungeons. And you do that by clicking on the Frequency of Encounter Checks tab. This presents a list of all the levels of all your dungeons and some controls that apply to each level. How this table works, though, is pretty simple. As you create a new dungeon level for a given dungeon, Dungeon Builder automatically adds that level to this list of dungeons and levels for those dungeons. And you can see that's a fair number of them here, which reflects all the dungeon levels that are down here. So as you add more dungeons and levels to those dungeons, this list will grow. As levels are added to the list, Dungeon Builder automatically assigns to them the default encounter table, as well as a default frequency of encounter checks of 0 rounds and a default probability of encounter of 0%. So basically the table is inactive. That's what that means. Now this default encounter table is obviously pretty important. So one of the first things you're going to want to do when you fire up your version of Dungeon Builder is to define monsters for your default encounter table to make sure that you're comfortable that it's a good template to use in all circumstances until you take the time to define a unique encounter table for a given dungeon level. But in order to associate an encounter table with the dungeon level, all you do is determine which dungeon level you want to use the encounter table on. And I'm going to use it on the first level of the Barrow Downs dungeon, and I'm going to click Barrow Level 1. Once you click Save, you have now associated that encounter table with that level of that dungeon. Your final step is to set the frequency of encounter checks that you want and the probability of an encounter that makes sense to you. I'll set the frequency of encounter checks to 8 and the probability of encounter to 40%. And then I'll save that. And I'm done. What this means now is that when I increment the game clock, either by moving the party icon or by directly increasing the time, when players are using my first level of the dungeon, of the Barrow Downs dungeon, Dungeon Builder will check for an encounter every 8 rounds, and there's a 40% chance that an encounter will occur. And if an encounter does occur, what happens is that Dungeon Builder is going to do a lookup on the Barrow Level 1 encounter table and determine what monster was encountered. Once it determines what monster is encountered, it's going to roll up all the monsters in that encounter as well as all their experience points and all of their hit points. It is as simple as that. Note that you can reuse your encounter tables among different levels of any dungeon and define totally different frequencies of encounter checks and probabilities of an encounter. So I can use this Barrow Level 1 in any other dungeon that I want to. I'm not just stuck having to use it here on this one dungeon level. And when I do reuse it, although the contents of that encounter table remain the same, the number of monsters and the number appearing, I can set different frequencies of encounters and different probabilities of an encounter for each use of that particular encounter table. So that is the complete process for creating your own unique encounter table and then associating it with a dungeon level so that you can use it in your encounters. Now in closing, I've got 2 final thoughts. When I'm in this dungeon level, when I go into the Barrow Downs dungeon and I bring up the first level here, whether I'm in draft mode or in play mode, i.e. whether I'm in a session or not, Dungeon Builder will use the encounter table that is associated with this level of the dungeon for all different types of encounters that can be rolled. So you can generate on-demand random encounters, you can generate timed random encounters, and you can generate set encounters. Whichever type of encounter you generate, it's going to use the Barrow Level 1 encounter table. And we'll talk more about how those encounter generation methods work in our next tutorial. Finally, this third tab, the Encounter tab, has 3 widgets on it that you see here. The Initiative switch tells Dungeon Builder whether it should roll initiative for each of your monsters when it rolls up an encounter. The default is no, so when you roll up monsters in an encounter, there's no initiative associated with them. It'll always be 0. But if you change this to yes, Then Dungeon Builder is going to use a die 10 based system for rolling up initiative for each one of your monsters, and it will show up on your encounter battle sheets as well as all the screens that show your monster encounter. This monster head here is used to generate your on-demand random monster encounters. For example, since I'm on the first level of the Barrow Downs, it should use that encounter table to roll up a random monster encounter using the Barrow Level 1 table. Okay? However, this little widget only works when I'm on a map. If I was out here on a different screen and clicked on it, no dungeon level selected, so therefore the function doesn't work. We'll talk more about that encounter screen you just saw in a moment when we get to our second tutorial on managing encounters. But this particular widget, this on-demand random monster encounter, is very useful when your players are just sitting around wasting time and you want to get them moving again. And finally, the Show Encounter list displays a list of all the saved encounters for your dungeon. We'll discuss this feature fully in the next tutorial as well. Remember, that's Encounters 2, Managing Encounters. And that's what I wanted to cover in this tutorial. Thank you very much.